This is an oral presentation interview conducted for the to War Serving a Nation project at Nauset Regional Middle School on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. For the sake of this interview, please state your full name and community in which you reside.
Eric Nicolaysen, Chappaqua, New York.
What did you do after you finished high school?
After I graduated from high school, I went directly to college, Rutgers University, where I basically was studying engineering.
Why did you decide to join the Army?
Well, in those days, everybody was subject to a draft, and since I was participating in the track team as a runner, the chances of my being deferred after college rather than drafted was virtually nil. So I decided that what I wanted to do was become an officer rather than being drafted. So I took the position of, I first joined the reserves as an enlisted man. It was the Rainbow Division. I started out as a private, normal training, weekends, one night a week, 2 weeks during the summer. And I made corporal, and I was just due to become sergeant when I graduated from college. And upon graduation, since I'd been simultaneously taking ROTC courses, I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Signal Corps. This basically was forced upon me by the current draft regulations that were in existence at that time. If I'd done nothing, I would have been drafted into the Army as a private.
How did your parents feel about your decision?
I don't think they thought too much about it one way or the other. They never made any comments. They understood at that time that what I was doing. At that time, it was between the Korean War and the beginning of Vietnam, so military duty at that point was relatively safe. And I think in many ways my father was fairly proud. My mother never made a comment one way or the other.
How did you feel as a child about the war?
Well, I was growing up during the World War II era, and everybody at that point felt that the conditions that were going on and the attacks by the Japanese and the Germans, and then subsequently the treatment of prisoners and or civilians by both countries was such that almost everybody felt that it was a righteous war, and it was required. And although there was a lot of loss of life, etc., they felt not doing anything would have been even worse. To let the Japanese or the Nazis take over control of the world, which was their aim.
What were your hobbies as a kid?
Really didn't have that much in the way of hobbies. Used to read a lot. Was a scout primarily in college. I ran all year round, cross country, indoor track, regular distance running during the spring, and that primarily was what I did.
What did you do in the Boy Scouts?
I didn't make an eagle. Made first class, and I think there's a rank in between, but I frankly have forgotten what it is. But used to enjoy the camping and the hiking and things of that nature. So,
What emotions did you feel leaving home to go into the Army?
Well, having been going to summer camp and things of that nature over the years, I was sort of used to it. The biggest event that I had was that after I was commissioned as an officer, approximately 6 months later, I got married, and when I was sent to Korea, I missed leaving my wife behind, who I didn't see for another 16 months while I was serving in Korea.
What kind of friends did you have before, and what happened? What were their emotions when you left?
Well, most of the friends that I had in the college were also following a similar program that I had of continuing through ROTC, and most of them became officers. We were dispersed to different branches of the Army. We did maintain contact over a period of time, but like many others, when you don't see people for a long period of time and dispersed to various jobs around the world, etc., around the country, it was sort of a drop-off of contact over a period of time. A couple of them I did maintain contact, but both of them are deceased at this point.
Can you describe your state before, your mental state before?
State before?
Like your mental state? Like how?
I just felt it was an obligation or a duty that we owe an obligation to the country to do that which we can, rather than simply the what nowadays appears to give me type attitude, rather than owing any obligation. And I never really thought much about it. I felt that once I became commissioned, I had an obligation to do the best I could, and wherever I was going to go was out of my hands, so I just really didn't think about it that much.
What conflicts did you engage in during your time in the Army?
Well, it was after the war. Korean War was settled, and I was with the 51st Signal Battalion in West Uijeongbu, which was 10 miles south of the DMZ. Our unit had to establish communications between I Corps headquarters at Uijeongbu and the various frontline troops on the DMZ and back to Seoul to 8th Army. And as such, we were providing communications to the UN troops, which included the Americans, the South Koreans, the British Commonwealth, Australian, New Zealanders, Brazilian troops, Greek troops, Turkish troops, medical units from the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, etc. Real UN conglomeration, and we provided the online and radio communications with all of these units, which are strung out across the DMZ, ultimately back to 8th Army in Seoul. And as such, what the North Koreans were doing, even though the armistice was signed, is they had an habit of infiltrating a small unit through the DMZ, or sending them around by ship, fast boat, to around the ends of the two ends of the DMZ to come ashore in South Korea and then try and disrupt or attack independent units. And since our units were spread out over a period of considerable distance in small groups, we had more than one occasion whereby we would come into conflict with the North Korean infiltrators, which then produced a situation whereby our entire unit had to go on alert and react. But then what they would do is we would bring in infantry units and armored units from the DMZ to control the problem. It was never a major problem. It was just majorly a disruption. Only a couple of our people got wounded. Nobody got killed. And the North Korean infiltrators were singularly unsuccessful in causing much of a disruption. They did disrupt, but they certainly did not accomplish what they intended to do.
What was your take on what you did in Korea?
Well, it was a job. I mean, it was a matter of providing a standard procedure communications program for the Army, which involved wire communications. It involved radio teletype, microwave communications, encrypting messages and things of that nature. It was just a standard military, but to a large extent it really was more with the exception of the infiltration and some other things like that, it was more a peacetime type of operation rather than a combat type of operation.
Can you describe the towns and natives you met in Korea?
Can I describe what?
The towns and natives you met in Korea?
Well, at the time that we were over there, it was just after the war was over, and I'm assuming North Korea was the same, but South Korea was completely devastated. If you went to Seoul, there was no glass in any of the windows of the buildings down there, and almost all buildings had either shell holes or bullet holes into the buildings, or the buildings that were completely knocked down and still rubble. So it was a rebuilding operation for the South Koreans, and I assume the North Koreans were the same thing. South Koreans, if you take a look now, has really grown into a tremendous country compared to what it was in that time. A lot of people had difficulty finding shelter, particularly during the winter. A lot of people were living in tents and things of that nature while the country was being rebuilt. In addition to being a signal unit, since we had bulldozers, etc., we did provide some limited rebuilding of roads and bridges and things of that nature. Army Corps of Engineers did a lot more in that type of work, but they had to rebuild almost all the major bridges and redo the roads. The roads are in very poor shape. If I drove to Busan, which is really not that far in a distance, because of the condition of the roads, etc., it would generally take me close to 2 days to drive from where I was stationed to Busan, which is probably only a couple hundred miles, but the roads were just lousy condition, etc. We were grading them and doing things of that nature and helping the South Koreans rebuild.
What was your saddest moment in the war?
Hard to say. Really, there was no deaths that occurred at the time that I was there. There were some deaths up on the DMZ, but that was outside my sphere of contact, so I really didn't. We participated in a couple of funerals, but it's not like an active, ongoing war at the time that I was there.
What was your happiest moment in the war?
I think probably having some meetings, establishing some new friendships. As a unit, we got along pretty well with each other, and as I said, I did maintain contact with some of them after we got back, particularly a couple of them that lived in New Jersey and New York. But again, they're no longer here at this particular point.
What comes to mind when you hear the word Korea?
The differences in the two countries and the way the South Koreans have become a major world power, and the North Koreans have retained the same ideological attitude that they had before, and a country that really is not taking care of its people and is really total dictatorship. It's amazing the difference in the two countries.
What was the most important moment in your Army career?
Probably when I was relieved of duty and returned to the United States.
What did your friends think when you left, if they were still there?
Well, almost all my friends were also officers, so basically we were all doing the same thing. We were all, going different places. Some of them went to Germany, some of them went to other places around the world. A lot of them went to Korea with me. There were 4 or 5 of us that shipped into Korea. 3 of us were in the Signal Corps. The rest were in Ordnance, Quartermaster. Some were infantry, some were armored. So it was a...
What was the first thing you did when you got home?
Kiss my wife.
How did you describe your time there?
It was a learning experience. We were short of officers, and The unit that we had is the 51st Signal Battalion, had approximately 900 enlisted men, and we're supposed to have 31 officers, and we only had about 18 or 19 at most times. And then in addition, we had another 700 or 800 what they called Katusas, or Korean troops, that were attached to our unit for training purposes, etc. So it was all of us served multiple functions as officers, because we were training both the Americans and the South Koreans at the same time. So it spread the officers pretty thin across all the jobs that we had to do. I was a battalion morale officer. I was battalion motor pool officer. I was all sorts of odd jobs that were given to me as a second lieutenant, but every officer was spread into multiple units. I subsequently ended up giving up the motor pool and became the radio teletype unit, which is where we had radio teletype units sitting on mountaintops from all the way up at the DMZ down to Pusan. And in those days, what you did was communications was handled by paper tape. What somebody would do was encrypt a message. Would be punctured into a tape, and then what you do is you take that tape and you'd feed it through a machine which would transmit it electronically to the next radio teletype unit, and then they would transmit it to another one, and would take like 4 or 5 transmissions down the peninsula, the Korean peninsula, to get a message from the DMZ all the way down to Pusan. And I was responsible for maintaining these units and seeing they continued to operate.
What was your hardest decision to make?
Leaving my wife.
How do you feel that do you feel like you made the right decision to go into the war, do what you did?
I think it's part of my obligation to the country, and I learned a lot from it. You got to remember that we were given it as a young lieutenant. You're given a tremendous amount of responsibility and multiple jobs to do. It's in many ways it's far beyond what the average person who goes into civilian life is given in the way of authority in the very beginning. As an officer, you're I don't care which branch you're in, you've got a large amount of equipment to take care of, you've got a large responsibility on the thing, and you have a lot of people that are under your control, in which you're ordering around and seeing to it that they're trained and given jobs and being prepared for anything that might occur.
Can you describe a typical meal that got served to you?
Pardon?
Can you describe a typical meal that was described to you?
Well, the meals were reasonably good. When they were served in the mess halls. Mess halls were in what they call Quonset huts, which are a half-round metal building, and we had the mess hall. But if we were out in the field, we were given the standard M&C sea rations. It was interesting in the context that even though we were over there in the 50s, the rations that we were being giving out had been put together back in the 1943s, 44, 45. So when you open up a sea ration or something, the cans in there were 10 years or more older. But they used to give us like canned meatballs and canned SpaghettiOs and canned peaches, and in those days, standard procedure from World War II was that every one of these ready-to-eat meals, or what they now call ready-to-eat meals, always used to have a little packet of cigarettes in there, 3 or 5 cigarettes in a little container, although at that time they were pretty well dried out from having been put together in World War II, but that was standard procedure. And we had a little metal lever thing that you went around and you opened up the top of the can to we didn't have stoves to heat them, so we ate them cold. Or what we used to do is we would take them and we would puncture a hole in them, and then we put them on the top of the muffler on a truck and heat them sitting on the muffler.
Can you describe your camp?
Well, the camp was all Quonset huts in our base. Out in the field, it was all tents, or we would sleep in the vehicles. In Korea, the wind, particularly during the winter, comes down out of Siberia. So therefore, being in the field with temperatures 20 degrees below zero during the winter was not at all unusual. So that it was very difficult to stay warm. We had multiple layers of clothes that we had to wear, and 2 or 3 sets of gloves, etc. Made it difficult to manipulate things. And it was also a case too that if we went off the road and drove through a stream during the winter, the drivers would have to pump on the brakes to dry them out. If they failed to dry them out, the brakes would freeze overnight if you parked. So what we used to do is we used to carry the old type of blowtorches that plumbers used to use, which had fuel in it. You pumped it up and then you ignited it, and then we'd have to crawl underneath the trucks and spray it on the brakes in order to release them. Otherwise you couldn't move the vehicles.
Knowing what you know now, what would you do differently?
I don't think I would really do much of anything differently.
What do you feel that you've done has helped for your country? Like you've helped your country?
Well, I mean, we were a fencer against the North Koreans starting the war all over again. I mean, they still, even though they had pretty well decimated, the ratio, I've seen various figures, but we lost about 30,000 Americans were killed. The South Koreans indicate that they lost about 500,000, when the number of civilians lost is completely unknown. But I've seen various figures that the North Koreans and the Chinese lost anywhere from 1.5 to 3 million men in combat. And had we not done what we did and not stayed there, the North Koreans / Chinese would have reactivated the war as soon as they possibly could. Their tanks and stuff were pretty well decimated during the war, etc. But the Russians and the Chinese re-equipped them very rapidly after the war, and there was always a potential that they would come south. They used to have this game of all of a sudden rushing their troops and artillery up to the DMZ, and then they would suddenly have planes come sweeping south towards the DMZ. And since if they crossed the DMZ to get to Seoul, and the air bases that we had there would only take them about 7 minutes, once they started coming, we'd immediately go on alert and disperse to the field. And what they do is they come down and they get just north of the DMZ, and they'd make a U-turn and turn around and head north, and then they'd turn around and come back down again. So you're never sure if they were playing games or if they were going to try and start the whole thing again. But they had massive amounts of tanks and artillery and men lined up across the DMZ, and they would do this 3 or 4 times a year. So immediately what we had to do was, once the alert came down, we'd grab our weapons, jump in our trucks, and start heading for the field.
Can you describe your training experience before the war or during the war?
Well, the training was standard training for an officer. They trained me in microwave equipment when I first went in, and then the microwave equipment was mainly in Hawaii at that point, so I didn't see much of it in Korea. But once I got there, then it became my job to train the staff. So basically what I was doing was working through the training manuals and then with my sergeants, would be training people in radio communications, switchboard operations, encryption, transfer, etc. And then we train the infantry units and stuff in their communications, etc. So it was a matter of, and the same thing for the other UN troops.
Do you feel like your knowledge of the war?
I'm sorry, what?
Do you feel like the knowledge of the war helps you with your past war experience?
I think the discipline of the type of work that I had to do helps, but the knowledge of the war probably not.
How do you feel about the U.S. spending money on military?
If one looks at the World War II and the overrunning of various countries by both the Japanese and the Germans, and then what we have nowadays in terms of the ISIS and the Russians raising problems in Iran, etc. In my estimation, the money has to be spent. Otherwise, there are countries that are run by dictators that are opportunistic and will try and take over as much as they possibly think they can get away with.
Do you think that your post-war life has helped you with your experience from war and childhood?
I just think serving in the military is a disciplinary activity that changes a lot of mental thought, and I think I just wish more people served in the military. Right now, during World War II, about 16% of the American males served in the military, and the rest of them served in war-related activities. Now it's down to less than something like 1% of the people are actually serving in the military, and 99% have very little contact with the military.
How do you feel about taking over your family's business?
Well, I've enjoyed the insurance business. Having studied engineer, I've also built commercial and residential buildings as a sideline. The building we're in right now, I built myself. Did the piling, the construction, hired the subcontractors, checked on the quality of the work, etc. And I think it's definitely helped in providing focus on the business.
Can you describe your volunteer work?
Well, again, it's back to the community, but I've spent some 50 years in the ambulance, the fire department, served on the town board as a elected official, currently serve on the assessment board of review, establishing tax rates for the taxpayers, past president of the professional insurance agents in the state of New York, has about 30,000 insurance professionals as members of the organization. A lot of that type of stuff. Worked in scouting, worked in Little League, etc.
Do you think that your volunteer hours have helped you with your kids, your family?
Well, so far I'm very happy with the way my kids have turned out. So I really, I think they've picked up the idea of volunteering too, and it's been all to the good as far as that's concerned.
How do you feel about your son passing you in ranking?
It's sort of a running joke. It's my grandson. He went through ROTC, did much the same as I did. He joined, but again, was not under the same pressure as I was of knowing of being drafted, because that draft rules have gone by. But he served as an enlisted man in an Army unit at college. Took a commission. He's now in the armored, and we've had jokes that as when he was a second lieutenant, I was a first lieutenant. He had to, and then when he became a first lieutenant, I said, well, I had time and grade as a first lieutenant over him, so I still outranked him. But now that he's made captain, I guess I'm going to have to start saluting him.
How do you feel about your insurance agency that connects to your war history?
Well, I think that the discipline that I got from the military disciplines me to organize and do my work here in the business.
How do you take on the politics for foreign affairs?
I think the United States, based on the people we have elected people who've talked a good fight, but basically don't have the stomach for really what is required in today's world. There's a lot of treaties that have been negotiated and things of this nature, and where civilian people have probably been detrimental to the benefits of the United States.
Do you feel that there might be a threat from War 3 or from North Korea?
I don't think from North Korea. I'm more inclined to be concerned about Iran and China. I think the recent actions of the Chinese of building their massive army, long-range missiles to attack our fleet at sea, the building of the bases in the China Sea, etc., are all an indication of a country that is becoming highly belligerent. In addition, if you take a look at what the Chinese are doing around the world and their various base locations, etc., I think they're aiming to intimidate us, if not to supersede us as a leading world power.
What is your take on the draft at your time and present?
Well, my personal feeling is I think taking away the draft was not a good idea. Even if we just drafted people to serve in a civilian corps, such as working in hospitals and stuff like that, a couple years of civic activity and things of this nature would be, in my estimation, all to the good in terms of educating responsibility towards the country of the average person.
Do you feel like your education helped you to put you where you are today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, engineering is a disciplined. It's not a case that there's multiple answers. There's a right and a wrong answer, and that's it. So it's a case. It provides mental discipline.
Are you okay or happy with the life you were given and what you've done with it?
Yeah, I think so. Main thing is that I've got no major problems with any of my children or with any of my grandchildren. They all have been successful. They all have indicated that they've all accepted some responsibility towards their communities, etc. I think it's all to the good.
Alright, thank you.